Hello, everybody. We'll take a few minutes before we get started to let people enter the room. It's great to have you here, so stay tuned. Again, for those of you arriving, we're going to give another minute or so for people to arrive. I see the numbers of participants climbing quickly, so we want to give everybody a chance to zoom in. Okay, I'm going to start with some announcements. First of all, just welcome everybody. It's a busy time in the semester. It's a busy time in our lives with lots of uncertainty. I really appreciate you all coming to join us for another Hope Cunningham environmental lecture. My name is Colin Oriens, and I'm the director of the Environmental Studies program, and we sponsor the Hope Cunningham lecture series. The Hope Cunningham lecture series is made possible due to a generous gift by Daphne Hope Cunningham and Roland Hoke, both alumni of Tufts. If you would like to receive alerts about the lecture series, we would encourage you to sign up either via the newsletter or the or see the full fall schedule. We're going to put those in the chat. So just to give you a little bit of logistics about today's program, we've disactivated the chat, but we are encouraging everybody to put their questions into the question answer session of this, and we will sort of either say, I will moderate the quick Q&A afterwards, or if possible, you could raise your virtual hand and we'll let you ask your question. We'll see how that goes. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Rachel Kyte. Rachel is the 14th Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts. She's the first woman to lead the program. She's a 2002 graduate of the Fletcher School and has been a professor of the practice since 2012. She has been really internationally recognized for her work. She's worked with the UN Secretary General to establish sustainable energy for all. This is a private-public cooperation. She was CEO of that for quite a few years. And she's really been sort of spearheading the ways in which we can sort of address climate change issues through sort of development in developing nations. So she's very much involved in the UN Sustainability Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. It's just as a side, my daughter was able to sort of intern at Sustainable Energy for All, and it was a great experience for her. So I know it's a fantastic organization, and it's an exciting way of sort of growing the sustainable energy needs of the globe. In 2020, she earned the New Year's honors, and she's been sort of recognizing her services to energy and combating climate change. Today, she's going to talk about what if nature had a seat at the table. Rachel Kyte, Dean Kyte, thank you for joining us. Looking forward to your talk.
Well, Colin, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be with you, and I'm going to share some PowerPoint slides as I sort of whiz through a sort of 64,000 foot exploration of would it be different if nature had a seat at the table. And I have to say that in sort of preparing for today, given the uncertainty in the United States, given the uncertainty in the world as it watches what is going on in the United States, not only the election process, but then what is happening now as the electoral process and the democracy that underpins it is tested. And on the day after the United States formally left the Paris Agreement, which is by, I think, any measure, the most extensive and momentous or consequential multilateral agreement on a global commons. I wasn't quite sure how bullishly sort of determined to be in this presentation and how much of a cautionary note to strike. So you tell me at the end whether we've got the balance right. So now I'm going to share my screen, hopefully. It's an anthropocentric question to ask, right? I mean, because only humans would ask, why would it be different if nature had a seat at the table? And there's, very rich scholarship on the anthropocentrism of this question from a legal perspective, from a political perspective, from an economic perspective. And I'm going to touch on some of that today, but would encourage you to explore these themes going forward, because I think this is increasingly a relevant issue. And now I've got to be, there we go. But let's just think about where we are at this point in time. We are in the middle of a crisis, but it's a compound crisis. COVID-19 hits us while we are in the middle of a climate crisis, and while we are in the middle of a sixth extinction, an extraordinary biodiversity loss. And of course, all three of these crises are interwoven in very complex ways. And so it is the compound crises that we have to assess. And we have to use that understanding in order to be able to plot our way forward. I think it's important to just reflect a little bit on what we are learning as we stumble our way through these compound crises. We are learning a lot about resilience, or our lack of it. We are understanding that you can't self-isolate from a pandemic. You can't self-isolate from climate change, and you can't pull the door closed on climate change and self-isolate. And one can't self-isolate from the implications and the impacts of biodiversity loss either. So this is an important wake-up call if we are able to do something about it differently going forward. We're also learning how brittle many of the systems we depend upon are. I think COVID in particular has highlighted the brittleness of the global energy system, as we've seen energy demand fall off a cliff, and with it push down prices of fossil fuels. We've seen impacts on employment in renewable energy, so big implications for the energy transition. We've seen a real brittleness of global food supply chains. In the developed world as in the developing world, we've all been transfixed by pictures of huge parking lots of people queuing up for food parcels in the United States. And of course, the extraordinary numbers of people who are expected to be pushed into famine across sub-Saharan Africa. And financial systems struggling to cope with the knock-on economic effects of the pandemic. We've seen that the traditional mechanisms of multilateral cooperation, whether it be on zoonotic diseases and their science, whether it be on the health implications of a pandemic through the WHO, whether it be the need for the world to come together to find a way to economically manage our way out of the crisis caused by the pandemic. So the discussions at the IMF and elsewhere, or the fact that at the Security Council, we've not been able to have a conversation bringing all of these crises together. And in fact had to wait months for the Security Council to even discuss the pandemic. We can see that the mechanisms of multilateral cooperation are strained, perhaps not equal to the task, perhaps not including those who really need to be at the table. And I think what's really important is that This is a crisis that we've been warned about. We've been warned, in fact, about every element of the compound crises. We've been warned about climate change, warned about biodiversity loss, warned about the impacts of a zoonotic pandemic. And we didn't get out of the way, and we didn't prepare. And this is a concept, I think, well described by Michelle Wooker as a grey rhino. It's not a black swan. The last time we had a global economic crisis, we discussed black swans. They were visible in the rear view mirror. We could understand them after they had happened and after we had glimpsed them. This is a grey rhino. It's not in the rear view mirror, it's right in front of us. It's charging down the pathway towards us. It's large, it's undeniably dangerous. And the question is, what do we learn about ourselves that we saw the risk, identified it, could even measure the speed at which it was coming towards us, but we didn't do very much about it. In the case of the pandemic, we were warned explicitly just over a year ago by a monitoring board put together in specific response to the last zoonotic pandemic to hit, Ebola, in the countries of Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, just 5 or 6 years ago. We put 2 august international diplomats with experience of humanitarian affairs, experience of health, and experience of the global environment in charge of it. The former head of the WHO, Gro Harlem Brundtland, and the former head of the International Committee of the Red Cross. They came out with a report. It was explicit that we were running a very dangerous risk of a pandemic, a zoonotic pandemic, a respiratory zoonotic pandemic, and we did very little about it. So in this moment, I think it's important for us to learn that we didn't do anything about it at the national level and at the international level, if we are going to brace ourselves for a really meaningful approach to the crises that will still unfold in front of us. So I think that if we think about grey rhinos and we think about the warnings, we have received on a metronomic basis, so with a regularity and an increasing sense of urgency, specific warnings about biodiversity loss and specific warnings about climate change. The raw science, but then also what the implications are for human health, for society, implications for the economy, implications for geostrategic relationships. All of this is in the public domain. So then where are we at this moment in time? Well, we can understand that we are in a moment where we have compound crises. We can understand that we don't have the mechanisms perhaps adequate to the task at the international level or at the national level. We can also understand that we are in a unique process of recovery. Unique in that the pandemic has hit almost every country, not all in the same way, and not every country has responded in the same way, but it has hit almost every part of the world. We can understand that the depth and the breadth of the economic impacts of the pandemic are unlike anything that we have seen so in modern economic history. So this is a broader based economic slowdown or recession or depression in some parts of the world, affecting every sector of the economy, some more than others, and with more countries seeking support and solidarity at the same time than has ever happened in economic history. We can think about the recovery in 3 stages: relief, a re-emergence, and a rebalance. I think we're still in the relief stage. For example, in my own country today, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Minister of Finance, as it were, has just announced that the furlough and the economic support to individuals and to businesses will be extended all the way through to March next year, which is, of course, what Germany and France and others have put in place. Other parts of the world are still in this relief phase, even as we start to think about what is the re-emergence. The re-emergence, of course, and we saw this in the election here, is the balancing of, if you go too fast, you risk dying from the infection. If you open up the country too quickly, and if you go too slow, you risk dying from hunger. So this tension between, can we keep the economy going and can we protect each other? And we can imagine that as we think about a recovery, that there is a rebalancing perhaps within society, certainly within Western society, about the value we put on health and economic risk. And you see this in the private sector, as many, many global companies are starting to look at the just-in-time production processes that they've been running in order to be enormously efficient, but which have left them very lacking in resilience to a moment of a pandemic. And so is there a resilience that has to be built into a global business model which doesn't put all of the premium on efficiency. So one aspect, one way to think about the kinds of things that need to be built into the recovery is this rebalancing. And of course, here we are at Tufts University with the extraordinary foresight of Dean Deborah Kuchiva and others, and an ability with a veterinary school, with a medical school, with an extraordinary School of Arts and Sciences, and with a School of Global Affairs, that we are very well positioned, and USAID recognise this, to work on One Health. So the uniting of human, animal, environmental health. And it's very interesting that the UN, in the middle of this pandemic, sort of put out a sort of set of critical actions that were needed if we were to move forward with a concept of One Health embedded in the recovery and embedded in future economic and political planning. First of all was to invest in interdisciplinary approaches. Well, tick that box, Tufts University, that's fantastic. The next was to invest more in the scientific discovery around zoonotic diseases, to fully cost account the social impacts of zoonotic diseases, the spillovers, again, tick that box, because that will be work I'm sure we will pursue at Tufts. Raise awareness of zoonotic diseases, strengthening monitoring, and importantly, just really getting to the heart of land management issues, both in terms of human incursion on nature, but also the management between agriculture and wild land. I think this is important because the question which I'm now moving into is this a reset moment? Are we good enough in this process of recovery to rethink how the economy has to work globally and locally, has to work to protect the planet, has to work to protect each of us as people. So it needs to be more inclusive, needs to be greener. And is it possible to do that without some space created for nature to speak for itself? Because at the very heart of these three compound crises has been the attack on nature. Are we able to address that without thinking about how that is represented in negotiations or in the way in which we plan? So there are three ways to think about putting nature at the table. One is legally, politically, and thirdly, economically. Legally, some jurisdictions have begun to think about ways to do that. Not comprehensively, perhaps, but based on their own cultural understanding of the importance of nature, have tried to push forward a way to, at least in part, give nature a seat at the table, or at least consultative rights. In Ecuador, the concept within the Andes, right, of Pachamama, the spiritual earth, the spiritual heart of things. In Ecuador, Pachamama has the right to exist, persist, mature, and regenerate, which become increasingly important as there's legal battles around the last sort of gasp of the fossil fuel economy continues. In Bolivia, they haven't quite done the same thing. But in Bolivia, while nature has not been given rights under the Constitution, humanity has no right over nature in the Constitution. So there's a balance which is different than many other jurisdictions. In New Zealand, of course, we all look at New Zealand having managed the way through the pandemic, perhaps better than most. Te Urewera, which is a river and forest, has been granted a legal personality in a landmark legal ruling. And that perhaps is something which many jurisdictions are looking at as precedent setting. And in India, cetaceans have been given a recognized status as non-human persons, which allows them to be protected in a way that wouldn't be possible otherwise. And of course, the river Ganga, which is a spiritual heart for many in India, has rights and is recognized as a personality. Politically, when we sit around the Security Council, when we sit at the General Assembly, when we sit at the G7 or the G20, when we sit at the OECD, there isn't a like an Elijah's chair. There isn't an empty chair for nature, but we have proxies for nature. Scientific panels are one incomplete, an attempt at a proxy, perhaps. Indigenous peoples often find themselves as the voice that expresses perhaps the pain of the earth not being respected, is able to at least bring an intergenerational equity into the discussion, that nothing we do now or everything that we do now we should think about in terms of its impacts over another 7 generations. The decisions we make now, how will they play for our children? Children's rights, of course, are only just beginning to emerge into being fully fledged in development and economic development considerations. And it's interesting, when I was talking to colleagues at the World Bank recently, where they said, look, you know, the biggest client base we have is children, given the demographic of low-income countries, and yet children have absolutely no voice in the decisions and the planning that we make. And I think that especially environmental NGOs would consider that they perhaps have been the closest proxy to a political voice for nature at the table of negotiation. But of course, as we know, both locally and internationally, which NGOs and whose voice is very important. Economically, there are many different ways to consider putting nature into the equation. We all know that the environment is the greatest sort of non-internalized externality. We see, even in the election that has just passed, you know, again and again and again, the idea that environmental regulation impacts growth and competitiveness and productivity. This is not true and has been put to rest perpetually for the last 30 years. We've seen over the years a great movement towards natural capital accounting, full cost accounting. Itself controversial in that while we need to value nature, many people reject the idea that you can put a price on it, and that pricing in itself, in and of itself, is a tool from a toolkit which cannot ever properly value nature. And of course, actually there's a mistake on this slide, but the last point is this the moment to really make a final push to try to, alongside GDP, gross domestic product, have wealth accounting, have a different form of accounting that would perhaps include natural capital accounting. So over the last few years, we've seen a number of jurisdictions, Finland, New Zealand, Costa Rica, begin to use wellbeing budgets, to use different forms of accounts alongside GDP. But is this the time to do it? It would seem to me that, given that we're living in the middle of a compound crisis, now would be a time to understand that the basic measurements of success, GDP, fails us in 2 fundamental ways. It fails us in terms of not being able to take into account the destruction of the value of nature, and to not take into account the need to invest in health, education, and social safety nets. So if this was a moment of reset, then it's important that we imagine what the end state is. And the end state is really, can we restore nature in order to be able to thrive within planetary boundaries? Within that that large statement, we have all kinds of extremely knotty problems that we are going to have to deal with together at the same time if this recovery is to end up in a greener, a more inclusive world, in that world where we have restored nature in order to thrive economically and thrive socially. It means that we will have to aggressively reduce global warming emissions. And at the moment, we're sort of trying to account for how those emissions are going to come down, but we're not having a fundamental conversation about actually just phasing out fossil fuel discovery and use. So for example, this week, the Norwegian state oil company, Equinor, announced its extremely aggressive targets for becoming a net zero company by 2050. But when you get down into the fine print, it is going to continue to explore and going to continue to extract oil at a 3% increase, 3% growth rate over the next 5 to 6 years. So are we, while we talk about managing emissions down, are we missing a more fundamental question around actually ending fossil fuel exploitation? I'm not Pollyanna about this. I understand the difficulties of this. We are in a transition, but at the same time, if nature was at the table, what would nature say? We need an extraordinary process of investment in land restoration. Of course, in an economic recovery, there are good jobs to be had by paying farmers to keep soil in the ground and to keep the ability of land to be able to sequester carbon emissions. Aquifer and river protection, we have extraordinary pressure on freshwater resources. Are we able to move forward in this area? Indebtedness. Many low-income countries are at or about at their debt limits. Are they going to borrow in order to be able to manufacture a green recovery from the pandemic, to invest in the infrastructure that they need to give all of their citizens the development that they aspire to? And how can they do that if we're going to further indebt them? So there's a reset question there. And a reset question around how we plan our economies for greater equality. Before COVID hit, the IMF was sending out urgent signals that inequality was having a corrosive effect on development and economic growth, and therefore was sort of had to be top of mind. And yet we can't forget that as we now think about recovery out of the crisis. So we can see glimpses of a conversation about a reset. Gita Gopinal has said, and in a piece published this week, this is the chief economist of the IMF, that really the recovery has to be green. We see a conversation around, is there a way to deal with debt and decarbonisation at the same time? I'll come on to that in a little bit more detail in a moment. We can see that there is a conversation about the fact that there is only really one pathway out of this, a pathway of a recovery which does put us on a trajectory for zero emissions mid-century, which finds a way to invest in nature so that it is there to protect us, and finds a way to get people back into good jobs, to promote income, to rebuild our communities, and to invest in the resilience that they need. So we see glimpses of this around the Secretary General of the United Nations, around the Managing Director of the IMF, around the head of the European Central Bank, in the announcements from India, Japan, Korea in the last 6 weeks around a serious commitment to becoming net zero by mid-century. But these are glimpses, and they are matched by the short-term panic of how do we get people back to work? How do we protect communities coming out of COVID? And so this is a moment for us to think about, walking and chewing gum at the same time. We need to put scaffolding around the international system we have at the moment so that it can continue to deliver. But at the same time, we have to be able to use this moment to pause, use our scholarship to imagine how the system could work differently, how to put nature at the table, how to deal with these compound crises with policies that would drive through all of them. And so when it comes to the financing of a way in which to have nature at the heart of economic decision-making, political decision-making, is this the moment for a new Bretton Woods? The scaffolding is, can we, if there were to be a Biden administration, would there be a different discussion at the IMF about debt relief? Would there be an ability to offer special drawing rights at the IMF? The scholarship is, notwithstanding whether we have a Biden or a Trump administration, can we bring leaders together around a more fundamental reset, which is, what do we use alongside GDP so we have a better measure of success? Who needs to be at the table in order to negotiate debt relief for Africa? At that spurs African economies then to protect their nature, spurs African economies to be able to make the green investment in green infrastructure. Is that European central banks buying African debt? Is that a new generation of sovereign performance bonds? What is that? Is it a debt for nature or a debt for climate swap? So who needs to be at that table? well, for the first time, China should be at the table. India would have to be at the table. The Paris and London clubs of donors would have to be at the table. You would have to have not just global banks at the table, but private equity at the table. And then who else? Whose other voices would you have there? Would nature have a proxy at the table? Who could be that proxy? Nature have an ombudsman, somebody who could sit there for them. And so the challenge for you, if you're a student at Tufts University, if you're that generation, is that you have to be able to, as Greta Thunberg said when she spoke to the European Parliament, we have to be cathedral thinkers. We have to be able to look up and build something that will be there and work for the next generation. The people who built the extraordinary cathedrals of the Gothic age were building things that they would never see in their lifetime. The stonemason at Notre Dame would never expect to have seen the cathedral completed. And so what we have to do is see whether or not we can, at this moment of profound global crisis, find a way to build something that will be lasting, as the system that we're operating under now was built 75 years ago and has lasted. It's teetering at the moment, but lasted through this point. So are we able to be these cathedral thinkers? And then the cold water I have to throw over us is that whatever reveals itself to be the case in the next 24, 48 hours, this is a country divided. And this is a necessary nation in the conversation at the global level about how do we protect biodiversity loss? How do we act with urgency on climate change? How do we prevent future pandemic diseases, zoonotic diseases from taking hold? It's not the preeminent nation, but it's a necessary nation at the table. And it seems to me that with the country so clearly divided, whoever wins has got an extraordinary task in trying to find the places where we can come together. And we can look at other countries around the world where values have been rent asunder and where the values are not clear in the way in which politics are working. We can look at Ireland, the UK, France with experimentation in citizens' assemblies outside of government, trying to find a place where you can take the sort of stopper out of the bottle, let some of the steam escape, and find a way to talk to each other about, well, where are the values now? And then use that as a way to then inform the legislative assembly in terms of where is the preponderance of opinion within society. Could we imagine something like that happening in such a polarized and such a vitriolic political debate in this country? Well, we're going to need something, and we're going to have to find small steps that take us on the way to this cathedral thinking. We have to be able to do both. We have to be able to think with the ambition that we need to tackle these compound crises, because they will come again and again and again over the next decade, and they will become even more profound in their impacts. But at the same time, this is a country that's hurting, a nation that's hurting. We have to find the small steps to be able to move forward. So lots to talk about. I think if nature did have a seat at the table, we may be able to make better long-term decisions and have a slightly different pathway forward on the short-term decisions. But getting nature the seat at the table may seem beyond us at this particular moment, but it's a useful, I think, device for thinking about the particular nature of the existential and non-existential threats that we face, unless our economies work better for us as people and work better for the planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a very thought-provoking and important presentation. I really appreciate it. We're going to open it up for questions. I wanted to sort of lead with one quick question. I really appreciated your perspectives on resilience. It seems so important to sort of think about how systems are going to be resilient, because there's always disturbances. And I think about sort of Hurricane Maria and how it impacted the energy profile in Puerto Rico. And I know in your own work in sustainable energy, you've thought a lot about resilience. And I'm wondering if you might reflect a few minutes about how resilience thinking sort of informed your work at Sustainable Energy for All.
Yeah, well, I think it's a really good question. I think first of all, decentralized energy, decentralized renewable energy is possible because of technical advances and because of the extraordinary collapse in the price or drop in the price of solar PV in particular and storage batteries. And so it's impossible to, so it is actually possible to imagine that remote communities, low-income communities, marginal communities, communities that have not been reached by the grid traditionally, can have access to reliable, affordable, and clean power. And the really great news is that that can actually be provided in a way that's very resilient to countries that suffer from extreme weather events, etc. So the resilience comes, you can really reach the poorest of the poor. You can really reach the last mile. The last mile can be the first mile. And that's whether you're in the Caribbean and you're in the pathway of ever intensifying hurricanes, whether you're in a displaced persons camp somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa and you're not really a camp in the middle of a community that's also not reached by the grid, or whether you're in a small island developing state, or whether you're in the pathway of typhoons in the Philippines. It's also true, from the fallout from Superstorm Sandy in New Jersey and across Europe. So there, where you have a grid, where you have off-grid energy alongside a grid, the whole community has much more resilience. And that being, it used to be the idea that the grid would come this far, and then you would have off-grid, and then as the grid extended, off-grid would suddenly become not competitive. All of the evidence is that you can actually have the two things in working at the same time and build resilience that way. But I think the most important thing that we did, and again, it was this kind of, let's sit back. What is the question we are trying to answer? What is the exam question we need to answer? And it really became very clear that if we could reach the last mile, if the last mile became the first mile, so if we thought about, if we didn't think about these communities as, the furthest away and therefore the most expensive to reach, the new technology and the new pricing of that technology allowed you to think of them as not the last, but the first, then everybody else we could easily reach. And so if you designed integrated energy policies that set the goal that you could actually reach everybody in the country at a given price per connection, that would allow you to think very differently. And if you adopted the traditional mindset of, we have a centralized power generation in the country with a grid that gets out as far as it does, depending on how much money we have, with huge transmission losses, and then to extend that grid would cost us billions and billions of dollars, then of course you don't reach those people and you don't improve their resilience. You don't allow them to participate in the community or in the economy, and then the country is irresilient as a result. So I think the most important learning we took from SE4 was to just flip the question around. And then it becomes quite liberating, because then it's like, okay, in 16 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, 80% of the people who don't have access to renewable, affordable, clean energy live. They are mainly women-headed households. They're highly rural communities, highly very remote, or they are living in peri-urban settings on the edge of fast-growing cities in Africa and South Asia. Okay, so now we know who they are. Do we know how much they can afford? Do we know what they would spend on energy? Can we get it to and then you start to be able to see things actually move quite quickly once the policymakers have understood that it's possible to do.
Thank you. We have a few questions in the chat. Two of them are related to the division in this country that you alluded to there at the end. And I'm going to read them both, then you can answer them. So, do Republicans want nature to have a seat at the table? And the other one, in this US election, nearly half the country has said that it does not care about nature. At least that's one interpretation in the way you've laid out. So could you please address the fundamental lack of human concern over nature?
Well, I think that I'm not going to speak for a Democrat or Republican, but I don't think you can say that Republicans reject nature. I mean, it's the history of environmental regulation in this country and the history of the protection of nature in this country is a powerful Republican story. The question, I think, is within both parties, but in particular within the Republican Party, what happened to that strong conservationist streak? Now, that strong conservationist streak from Teddy Roosevelt through to the Nixon administration, the creation of the EPA, through to you know, Duck Hunters United, whatever, which is one of the important conservation groups across many states in the United States. So these, which trends very Republican. The question is not so much, and that's they have a very anthropocentric view of nature as well. It's like, we are humanity, we will come and we will declare that area a protected area, and we will put a fence around it, and we will adore nature, right? So it hasn't been necessarily a friendly approach to the role of nature as would be understood by perhaps the native peoples and the indigenous peoples who've lived with nature in that location for centuries, right? So first of all, there was a strong conservationist, strong environmental streak within the Republican Party. It hasn't completely disappeared. Why? It's losing out to an economic rationale that deregulation is important. And I think what we've seen under the first term of the Trump administration has been an all-out attack on environmental regulation, both clean air and water, and other forms of protection, including mercury and things that I think most people thought had been legislated and there was no debate anymore. That's not coming from an attack on nature. That's coming from an ideological view about the role of regulation. Environmental regulation will tend to get in the way of planning. So I think we have to be careful in how we frame this. How do you get it back? I think that there is, there's bipartisan support for renewable energy for poor communities in Africa. There's bipartisan support for promoting clean technologies, even in red states. So I've been looking at the amount of investment in Florida and Texas into renewable energy in the last 2 years alone under a Trump administration, which avowedly says that they're going to support the coal industry and fracking. So I think that there is an inconsistency if you look at it from the perspective of nature, but it's an ideology of deregulation and it's money in politics. It's who is sitting at the table, who is paid for their seat at the table, and how loudly are they screaming for what they want. Perhaps another reason why somebody needs to buy nature a seat at the table.
Yeah. Well, this is a perfect transition to a couple questions that talk about getting a seat at the table. So Park Wildy writes, for Tufts University, what would it look like to be a leading global university that recognizes nature as having a place at the table? What would it mean for how we teach, and what would it mean for how we conduct research?
That's a brilliant question. I don't know, answers on a postcard and then you get a prize there. So first of all, I think I think it becomes a whole of university approach to sustainability. We'll use sustainability as a shorthand, right? Because the sustainability or the sustainable footprint of the university, I think, is being reviewed externally at the moment. We of course have the committee that's meeting to look at questions of divestment of the endowment as well. So for me, and we also know we've got other data points as well, right? We know that certainly for undergraduates and for the students of the future, they are making decisions on where they go to study based on the authenticity of the educational establishment when it comes to issues of climate change and of sustainability. This is a determinant factor in their decision making. So, we are blessed by this incredible constellation of schools, blessed by real excellence in each of them, blessed by some important decision making around the sustainability of how we run our operations. I think we should be now really stepping up. And that means looking at where the whole could be more than the sum of the parts. So we're doing fantastic work on renewable energy and engineering. We've got extraordinary work going on about the future of food across our arts and sciences, Friedman, Fletcher. We've got extraordinary ability to work on One Health now. We've obviously got all of the work that goes on in the natural environment across different schools. We've got Colin. We've got obviously using the medical school, the dental school as well. We've got a footprint on public health. So the question I think for us is to, okay, set the table for Tufts, and then ask ourselves the question, you know, with all of these parts, what would be the whole that would make it more than the sum of the parts? I think we have to divest the endowment. I don't see why we can afford to have an underperforming endowment and put our endowment at risk by investing in industries which are going to be zombies within 10, 20 years. I think there's other little bits of housekeeping we need to take care of, but I think we could have a really interesting exercise building on what's already being done, the CREATE programs that are run by the Office of Vice President for Research, but ask ourselves, with this extraordinary constellation of schools, with everything that we're already doing, what's the next thing that would really make us stand out from the crowd? And I've got ideas about that, what it would be, but I think there are others probably with much better ideas.
I look forward to hearing more about those conversations and ideas as they emerge. One of your students actually writes, I'm a marine biologist by training and now a GMAP student. And as a scientist, one of the reasons I applied to Tufts and got interested in this area of international relations and diplomacy was so I exactly could put nature at the table. And so one of my main learning is that scientists don't always know how to get to the table. And so she's wondering if you have any advice for scientists on how to get to the table.
So that's so go GMAP. That's a really excellent question. I think that it's been interesting to look at COVID, right, and looking at how different countries, different jurisdictions have managed the process of taking scientific or authoritative viewpoints from scientists into the policy making process. And we've seen jurisdiction after jurisdiction after jurisdiction struggle with understanding the science, and then the fact that the science won't tell you what to do. There is then understanding the science, and then there is the process of, okay, in that case, based on that science, we have the following set of options, risk rated, however way you want to do that, and then a decision has to be made by politicians. So we've seen very sophisticated or countries that believe that they are sophisticated in the way in which they have statutory bodies for science to be coming into effect really stumble. So in the UK, where we have a chief scientific officer for government, where we have emergency groups set up with scientists on them, it's really been very difficult because the politicians have either wanted to scapegoat the scientists or have wanted to perhaps not follow the logic of what the science is saying. The same is true with climate change, same is true with biodiversity loss, same is true with ocean impacts, etc. The takeaway, if you are a scientist, I think, is being able to frame the science in such a way as it can be interpreted in the policy environment, and in such a way as the policy environment is less able to sort of mess around with it. And I think it's really, there's been very, very interesting work done on who is better at communicating risk. And I think there's been some interesting work done on how the military communicates risk in a strategic security setting. And so, if you're the Joint Chiefs of Staff and you're sitting in front of the president wants to know whether he is supposed to order an attack on a threat. The way in which the military would convey that threat is different than the way maybe public health specialists would convey the threat from a disease for a decision to close down a border, etc. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done in how science presents risk and presents threat. And I think studying that and working out the language and how to write that and how to speak that is where science could help itself.
Thank you. This is, I think, a good transition to the next question. How do you see the balance of the public sector and private sector coming into play to create and build long-lasting environmental structures? And it goes on a bit longer, but I also just want to throw in, one person just asked for a clarification. What does internalized externalities mean? Maybe you could quickly cover that, and then going on sort of the balance between public and private.
So to internalize an externality is that the value, the intrinsic value of, in the case of environment, the intrinsic value of the environment is not included in the equation. So if the equation is sort of A plus B equals C, nature or the environment is not in A, is not in B, and therefore not going to be in C. So how do you find a way to make a decision around if you're not valuing, or if the value of nature is not in the equation? So if you're making a planning decision, and your planning decision is the cost of the expected growth that would come from having more people in a town, the cost of building more houses, the cost of building roads, but you don't account for the lost performance. How do you account for the lost ecosystem services of the marsh that you're going to be building over? How do you account for the value of that nature, because you can't go and walk in it and people can't have recreation in it? So how do you put a tangible value, and how do you internalize that value then in your equations and your decision matrices? So that's the short version of that. And I'm happy to give you I'm sure there are others that do it much better. We've got great economists, but there's lots written on this. The other part of the question was?
Well, the question is the balance between the public and the private sector, and whether or not one approach might be a little bit more effective or better than the other.
So if we just look at let's just take renewable energy at the moment, for example, right? Because I think it's a big part of the recovery, and it became a politicized issue during this election because of some falsehoods that were spoken by at least by President Trump. So if we think about this, the private sector is installing and investing in renewable energy in increasing amounts and more quickly, right? The energy transition is underway. It's doing that because it has concluded that there is a very good return to be had. That is concluded that it's a very smart investment. It's concluded that there will be growing demand, and it's concluded that the alternative is not a very good investment. It's done that despite a lack of a prevailing consistent regulatory approach from Washington. Now, at the state level, there have been very benign and extremely encouraging state regulatory frameworks, and that's why you've seen renewables taking off from Florida to Texas to Virginia to California, etc. So the private sector can do some things very, very well. What the public sector needs to do is send signals that make that process go even faster. And what the public sector needs to do is to make sure it works for everybody. So if you're on an extremely low income, that you can get access to reliable, affordable power. So there's a very important role for the government in this energy transition, in investing in R&D, because some of the advances that we're able to benefit from now, including the dropping away of price, are because 12 years ago we created ARPA-E, and we had big public sector R&D programs, public-private, but with a big public mandate in there. You need government in order to move laggards. So leading companies will innovate on their own and will look around the corners and make big decisions, but you have to pull the laggards as well. Laggards because you don't need them polluting, and also you don't want them polluting in poor neighborhoods. So you need government for R&D, government for laggards. You need government for making sure it works for everybody. So sort of the social safety net, the equalizing. And then I think you need government when where there will be moments of competing tension. So that's sort of planning and things like that. So deep water offshore, yes. For whom? Well, for Massachusetts, for all the states. Okay, what about the people who, think that it's going to impair their view of the ocean? These are things where government can step in and help see that resolved. So the role of the public sector is to put the guardrails up for the private sector so that their innovation, their investment, so that they get the return that they need, but so that the benefit of that can be felt for the most people in the most productive way. So government will set a target, or most other governments are going to set aggressive Paris Agreement targets now for emissions reduction. That's going to be delivered in large part in most countries of the world by the private sector. But setting that target as the government allows the private sector to know, well, that's my investment horizon, right? If we're going to be net zero by 2050, that means we're going to have to grow in renewable energy investment by a factor of 10, 20, 30 over the next 20 years. That's a good bet, right? So it's a partnership. And I think that the political concern in this country at the moment is that the United States should be in a race to zero in order to be able to be competitive globally. And this is where I think the question, there's a question before about Republicans. There are many, many Republicans who understand that the US is going to have to be in that race to zero. And if it got in, it could probably win it. But that it's no longer clear that the Paris Agreement was going to lead to economic demise. Be interesting to see if Trump is returned to the White House, how many sort of Republican-led states continue to double down on renewable energy, and what Washington would do about that.
Well, thank you for that inspiring answer. And lots of people are commenting how inspiring your talk has been. I'm going to do one last question, and then sorry I can't get to everybody's questions. There's just so many. The oceans represent 97% of the planet's biosphere, and unlike wild areas in the terrestrial world, very few nations think about the oceans as an important part of nature, being nature at the table. How can natural ecosystems of the oceans be top of the mind among global policymakers as we start to build back better in a post-COVID world?
So this is a great question. It's also another example of reframing, right? Language sometimes gets in the way. So when you think about the oceans of the world, and you think about the countries that have tried to bring the ocean agenda to the top of the political agenda, it's been small island developing states. Okay, well, just you show up and you're the small island developing states, then people look over your shot, they look straight over you, they don't see you. So the small island developing states have been very, very good at organizing themselves to punch a powerful punch above their weight in terms of GDP. But those small island developing states are great ocean states. Kiribati may have a landmass of 100 square kilometers or something like that. It accounts for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of miles of ocean in the Pacific. And so if you turn up to the negotiation as a great ocean state, then people have to pay a different attention to than a small island developing state. So I don't want to be too cute about it, but that has been a big part of the diplomacy of the small island states in the last decade in particular. They've managed to push oceans onto the international agenda. It's been quite difficult to do so. I think one of my concerns is one of the reasons why oceans is now coming up the priority list of items is because we may be at a point, because of technology and its advances, we may be about to herald a whole era of deep sea mining and seabed excavation in the search for the metals and the minerals that we need actually for a decarbonized society on Earth. So there may be a rub in why it's become important, but it's definitely become important. COVID threw off a series of very important negotiations on oceans over the summer. They happened online, but not in the same way. But I think the third of these conferences will be next year, and really, again, it becomes important when we look at the economics of it. It's difficult just to discuss the natural role that oceans play. It seems to be difficult for international diplomacy, but when you think that for most coastal countries, 40% of their GDP is in the 3 miles of their economic exclusion zone, or for most sub-Saharan African countries, the majority of the protein that people eat is coming from 3 miles off the 3 miles off the coast, then the importance of what is happening in the oceans becomes an issue of life or death. And I think that we're still at the point where we have to bring the intrinsic nature of oceans as an issue into those kinds of mundane economic terms in order to get it negotiated. The final point I would say, and this is very dear to our hearts at Fletcher, is that the Arctic and the Antarctic, the Arctic Ocean, what happens to the poles in the next 10 years will determine our fate on Earth as a species. And when you think about it, there is no effective way for the world to come together to talk about the Arctic as a crisis issue. There is an Arctic Council, there's an Arctic Circle. They are politicized or weak in their governance. Not everybody who needs to be sitting at the table sits at the table. And this will be one of the challenges. And it's a challenge for this decade because in 10 years' time, it might be too late.
Well, I'm sorry we have to stop the questions. Just great questions, everybody. Thank you for writing them, and I'm sorry I couldn't get to them. Dean Kyte, thank you so much for presenting to us and sharing your wisdom and prospects for the future. And I wish you the best and look forward to meeting in person when it's possible.
Well, Colin, thank you for all that you do, and hello to everybody. And keep your head in the cathedral thinking, and then let's work really hard every day just to make this world a better place.
Thank you.
Thank you.